Once upon a time, there was a game called Tetris. They made a movie about it. Years later, Nintendo would make a sequel called Tetris 2. Needless to say, nobody is making a movie about this game. But in 1994, a year after seeing release on the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Game Boy, Tetris 2 would grace the 16-bit Super Nintendo Entertainment System, a substantially different version that may retain the same gameplay as the previous versions, but has enough minor tweaks to make this seem like the definitive version of Tetris 2. The obvious difference is in the overall presentation, which has been overhauled from the 8-bit versions. Now, instead of a 10-tile backdrop thing, Tetris 2 takes place in a little playroom, and the backdrops, a different one for each of the game modes featured, are a little more playful and imaginative than before. The main playfield, the main well, is darkened so that you could focus on the gameplay. The layout is fairly clean looking, and some of the doohickeys move around after each round cleared. You also get brief animations after every 5th round cleared, and once again, these are just wonderful pieces of business that make it all worth checking out. The audio has been overhauled as well, ditching the stock tracks of the 8-bit versions. Tetris 2 features many background tracks, about 4 distinct songs for each mode, and again, these are very playful, very soothing songs, the type of mood that the earlier versions were trying for, but just couldn't pull off. Are they better tunes in general? That's a matter of preference, I suppose, but the sound effects aren't too shabby here. A little echoey, but that's about it. Now, of course, the overhaul of the audio-visual presentation means nothing if the core gameplay is trash. Fortunately, Tetris 2 not only retains the gameplay of its elder ports, and it's certainly not trash in that regard, so that's a good thing, but there's also a couple minor tweaks that makes this a more fun version of the game to play. Now, for those who have not been following along because we spent this past week covering the same game on different platforms, Tetris 2 is different from the usual Tetris fare because you're not clearing whole lines worth of blocks, but rather flash blocks or flash bombs from the field. This is done by lining up 3 or more blocks of the same color together in vertical or horizontal lines, and they go bye-bye. Naturally, your main aim is to clear the flashing flash bombs on the bottom because doing so will clear all the bombs of that color from the board. If you play the 8-bit versions, this is so far pretty old hat. Now, if you clear those bombs fast enough, you'll get some bonus points, of course, but unlike prior versions, if you manage to clear a round quickly, the game will actually knock a few bombs from the well on the next round. It's not a huge deduction, only a few bombs at most and none of the clutter surrounding those bombs, but just seeing a few of those bombs clear the board is enough of a push in momentum that you'd actually want to try and clear these things as much as possible, if only to earn that little help in the next round. It's this one minor thing that makes Tetris 2 on SNES a step above its 8-bit predecessors, at least in my opinion. You have your usual options. You could choose your starting stage from any of the 30 available different speed settings, as well as your choice of 3 or 4 musical tracks, I don't recall. And these are actually different tracks from the 8-bit versions, as I've mentioned. The game also offers a multiplayer component where you could compete against a friend, or you could choose to compete against the computer, choosing from 1 to 3 skill settings if you fancy that particular bit of action. And much like the Game Boy version, there's also a puzzle mode where you have to clear specific arrangements in the fewest moves possible. The more I play Tetris 2, the more it starts to grow on me eventually. Maybe this is due to just having played multiple versions of the same game within a short amount of time, but I came into this with a somewhat lukewarm reception of the game, a hybrid of Tetris and Dr. Mario, but not particularly good at either. But with this 16-bit version, it feels a bit more slick, and I'm not just speaking in terms of optics. It's the minor tweaks to the gameplay that makes it slightly better. Honestly, it's not that bad of a puzzle game, but those extra bits and extra polish gives us Tetris 2's peak incarnation on the Super Nintendo. And really, that's all there is to say. Tetris 2 on SNES is perhaps the most polished version of the game you could play, and is probably my favorite version of this weird amalgamation experiment of 2 popular games. I'd go so far to say that it's the most definitive version of Tetris 2 out there, and that's not a slight on the NES or Game Boy versions. Those laid the foundations, but this version just adds enough embellishments that it feels like a much better game than before. If Nintendo were to get the rights to re-release Tetris 2 onto whatever online service they got next, this SNES version should be the one to get up there. It is genuinely that good.